February 23, 1945. Iwo Jima, Japan. Corporal Frank Red Johnson of the 5th Marine Tank Battalion gritted his teeth as liquid fire roared from the nozzle of his Sherman's flamethrower turret. The beaches of Iwo Jima were a furnace of black sand and gunfire. Hidden pillboxes spat lead, and every cave seemed alive with the enemy's defiance. But this time, the Marines brought something new, a weapon so horrifying it silenced bunkers in seconds and left only smoke where fortresses once stood. As flames poured into the volcanic rock, Japanese soldiers faced a nightmare they never imagined possible. Could fire itself become America's deadliest ally? Here's how it happened. In the early years of the Pacific War, the United States found itself locked in a brutal struggle against an enemy that refused to die. Across the scattered islands of the Pacific, the Japanese soldier had become a symbol of defiance. Disciplined, resourceful, and willing to fight to the last breath. American troops expected battles. What they found were sieges of annihilation. From the atolls of Tarawa to the ridges of Peleliu, U.S. Marines and Army infantry advanced across beaches that were little more than killing grounds. Machine guns swept through the surf. Mortars fell like rain. Beneath every hill and coral mound, the Japanese had dug in, creating honeycombs of tunnels and bunkers invisible from the air. They were masters of the underground war, invisible until they chose to strike, and almost impossible to root out once engaged. The Marines learned that every bunker was a fortress, every trench a trap. Concrete pillboxes were built into the natural landscape, reinforced with steel and coral, their firing slits positioned with surgical precision. American artillery and naval bombardments pounded them for days. Yet when the dust cleared, the defenders emerged, shaken but alive. They waited, rifles ready for the next wave of attackers. At Tarawa in 1943, the lesson was burned into memory. The island was barely 2 square miles, but it consumed more than 1,000 American lives in 76 hours of fighting. Soldiers charged through surf and coral reefs under withering fire, their equipment bogged down, their flamethrowers sputtering after mere seconds. When Marines finally reached the bunkers, they found Japanese soldiers who had survived direct hits from naval shells. Many fought to the death inside the smoldering ruins rather than surrender. The Pacific Campaign became a grim equation. For every yard gained, a dozen men fell. The enemy's defenses were not merely physical. They were psychological, constructed to drain morale and instill hopelessness. Each new island seemed worse than the last. Peleliu, September 1944. The island's ridges were composed of jagged coral and volcanic rock, carved with hundreds of hidden caves and firing points. The Japanese garrison under Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had transformed the landscape into a labyrinth of death. American commanders expected a swift operation. Instead, the battle stretched for over 2 months. Temperatures soared past 110 degrees. Water was scarce. Flamethrower teams advanced inch by inch, incinerating caves one by one. When they ran out of fuel, they used grenades, satchel charges, or bayonets. The flamethrower, the one weapon feared even by the most fanatical defenders, had already been introduced, but its design was primitive. The M1A1 portable flamethrower weighed nearly 70 pounds when full. Its range was less than 30 yards, and its operator was an obvious target. One bullet could pierce the fuel tanks and turn the user into a torch. Yet the Marines carried them, because nothing else worked. Each assault was a nightmare of close combat. Infantrymen crawled through smoke and rubble, guided by the smell of fuel and the screams of trapped defenders. Flamethrower operators knew their life expectancy was measured in minutes once the enemy spotted them. They were often assigned volunteers, men who understood that the mission might be their last. Behind the lines, the Sherman tank represented brute force and reliability. Its 75mm gun could shatter walls and level trees, but even its shells were ineffective against deep concrete bunkers and tunnel complexes that lay beneath the surface. Japanese engineers had learned to use the earth itself as armor. Every entrance could be sealed. Every exit could lead to another firing point. Tanks rolled past positions that remained alive underground, waiting to strike once the infantry advanced. Commanders across the Pacific realized the pattern. The Japanese were not simply defending islands. They were defending every inch of soil as sacred ground. Their doctrine forbade retreat. Their commanders ordered them to inflict maximum casualties, even when defeat was inevitable. The result was an enemy that could not be bombed into submission. The Americans could win every battle and still feel as if they were losing the war. By late 1944, the cost was unsustainable. The Marines had gained experience and technology, but at an unbearable price. Every island secured came with another 1,000 graves. At Tarawa, it was 1 in 10. At Palaliu, nearly 1 in 3. Okinawa loomed ahead, and intelligence reports warned it would be worse. In Washington, military planners searched for solutions. They studied German fortifications in Europe, British tactics in North Africa, and lessons from the brutal island campaigns. What they needed was not just another tank or weapon. They needed a tool that could reach into the earth itself, to clear the tunnels and bunkers where men hid from steel and explosives alike. Fire, they realized, could do what bullets could not. The concept was ancient, yet its application in modern war remained crude. The early flamethrowers of the First World War had terrified soldiers, but were too fragile and short-ranged to dominate the battlefield. By the 1940s, engineers had refined the technology, but the fundamental problem remained: range and survivability. A man carrying a flamethrower could be killed before he came close enough to use it. A tank, however, that was another story. The Sherman's armor could withstand small arms fire, and its mobility allowed it to cross rough terrain. If its cannon could be replaced by a weapon that projected fire rather than shells, it might become the perfect instrument for destroying fortifications. Yet the idea was risky. A tank carrying hundreds of gallons of flammable fuel seemed like a death trap waiting to happen. Still, the desperation of the Pacific Front left little room for caution. Reports from the field painted a stark picture. At Palaliu, a single flamethrower team could neutralize an entire bunker system that had resisted artillery for hours. At Saipan, Marines noted that Japanese defenders often chose suicide over facing the fire. The psychological effect was undeniable. Even the most determined resistance faltered when engulfed in flame. The weapon's horror was its power. In the war rooms of Pearl Harbor and Hawaii, a small group of engineers and ordnance officers began discussing what seemed unthinkable: mounting a flamethrower inside a Sherman tank. The British had experimented with similar concepts in Europe, notably the Churchill crocodile, but adapting the design for Pacific conditions required ingenuity. The volcanic terrain, the heat, and the constant salt corrosion meant the system had to be both durable and self-contained. The stakes were enormous. A successful design could save thousands of lives. A failure could turn an entire tank crew into a blazing inferno. Yet for the Marines preparing for Iwo Jima, the risk was worth it. They had seen what happened when fire met concrete. They understood its potential. Every campaign up to that point had been a test of endurance. The Japanese had turned natural landscapes into fortresses. The Americans responded with steel and firepower. But fire itself might be the final key. By December 1944, work had begun in secrecy. Mechanics stripped down damaged Shermans and experimented with fuel pumps, pressurized tanks, and flame projectors. Technicians tested viscosity levels, trying to find a mixture that would cling to rock and penetrate ventilation shafts. Each trial ended with clouds of black smoke rising over the Pacific horizon. Something was changing. In the shadows of a Hawaiian workshop, amid the smell of fuel and molten metal, two of the war's deadliest machines, the tank and the flamethrower, were being fused into one. Deep in a secret workshop on Hawaii, engineers began fusing two of the war's deadliest machines into one. What began as a desperate experiment in a Hawaiian workshop soon evolved into one of the most terrifying machines of the Second World War. The M4 Sherman Crocodile, a name whispered with both awe and unease, was not designed merely to destroy. It was built to erase. Engineers stripped the standard Sherman tank of its bow machine gun, replacing it with a slender, sinister flamethrower projector that could spit fire hundreds of feet across the battlefield. The gun mantlet, once home to the tank's co-driver's weapon, now housed the mouth of an inferno. Behind it, deep inside the tank's armored belly, lay a complex system of fuel lines, valves, and pressure tanks, the beating heart of the beast. Inside the modified hull, engineers installed cylindrical tanks capable of storing hundreds of gallons of a new kind of fuel, a thick, sticky mixture of gasoline and rubber known as napalm B. Developed by chemists at Harvard in 1942, napalm was unlike anything seen before. Ordinary fuel burned quickly and dispersed. Napalm clung. It spread. It turned air itself into a weapon. When ignited, it created a heat so intense that even reinforced concrete began to crumble. Early tests were carried out far from prying eyes. On a secluded training ground in Oahu, mechanics watched as the prototype crocodile rolled into position before a line of decommissioned bunkers. The tank's operator flipped the ignition and opened the pressure valve. With a deep metallic hiss, a stream of flame erupted from the projector. It roared across the field like a living creature, splashing fire across the targets in sheets of liquid light. Witnesses later said it looked as though the air itself was burning. The bunkers disappeared behind a curtain of flame. When the smoke cleared, only molten rubble remained. Even hardened Marines fell silent. What they saw was both salvation and damnation. A weapon that promised to end the nightmare of the Pacific, but at a moral cost few could ignore. The system's design was brutally efficient. A small pump drew napalm from the internal tanks, mixing it with compressed nitrogen to create pressure. At the pull of a lever, the mixture was forced through a nozzle and ignited by a spark generator at the muzzle. Each burst lasted only a few seconds, but within that time it could cover an area the size of a baseball field in fire. The range, nearly 150 yards, was far beyond what any infantryman with a backpack flamethrower could dream of achieving. Tank crews began calling them Zippos, after the popular lighter brand that never failed to ignite. The name stuck. There were still problems. The additional weight from the fuel system strained the Sherman's suspension. Fuel leaks posed a deadly risk. If an enemy shell hit the storage tanks, the entire vehicle could erupt in a catastrophic explosion. Yet each flaw was met with determination. The mechanics worked night and day, refining valves, shielding the lines, and testing new ignition systems. They understood the stakes. Iwo Jima loomed on the horizon, a fortress island unlike any before it. American intelligence estimated more than 20,000 Japanese soldiers entrenched in tunnels and bunkers across the volcanic terrain. The battle was expected to last weeks, maybe months. The casualty projections were staggering. In the words of one Marine engineer, "If this thing works, maybe we'll bring some of our boys home alive." Commanders reviewed the reports from Hawaii and gave the order. Begin conversion of selected Sherman tanks into flamethrower variants. The process spread quickly through the Marine Corps' armored battalions. Each division preparing for the Iwo Jima invasion would receive a handful of these new weapons, enough, it was hoped, to clear the bunkers that artillery couldn't touch. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions received the bulk of the prototypes. Some were built locally at the Hawaiian base using existing Shermans. Others were modified aboard ships en route to the combat zone. The secrecy surrounding the project was extreme. Many tank crews didn't even know what their vehicles were capable of until the final days before the invasion. To the outside observer, the flame tanks looked almost identical to standard Shermans, except for the small narrow barrel mounted on the bow. It was only when they fired that the difference became unmistakable. During live fire demonstrations before deployment, officers and enlisted men gathered to watch the first official test. The target, a reinforced concrete pillbox modeled after Japanese fortifications. The crocodile's turret turned, the projector adjusted, and the hiss began again. A cone of orange flame shot forward, cutting through the air with a sound like tearing metal. The fuel splashed against the structure, igniting instantly. Within seconds, the bunker was engulfed. The concrete cracked from the heat, the interior temperatures rising past 2,000 degrees. The test ended in silence. Then came a murmur of disbelief. The weapon had worked. Perfectly. Reports sent to Pacific. Command described the effect as decisive and demoralizing. A single flame tank could achieve what dozens of artillery pieces could not. The destruction of fortified positions without prolonged bombardment. More importantly, the weapon broke morale. Soldiers who would otherwise fight to the death often chose to flee or surrender rather than face the flames. Commanders were divided. Some questioned whether such a weapon should even exist. Others argued that the Japanese had left them no choice. Major General Keller Rocky of the 5th Marine Division summed up the sentiment shared by many. War isn't about fairness. It's about survival. If fire makes them stop shooting, we'll use it. As modifications continued, the tanks were further refined. Engineers moved the fuel storage from external trailers, as used by the British crocodiles, to internal compartments, reducing vulnerability. The projector's swivel was improved, allowing a wider arc of fire. The fuel consistency was also adjusted. By thickening the napalm mixture, the flames could stick longer, crawl into trenches, and even travel upward along rock faces. Each tank crew received specialized training on handling the volatile system. They learned to control fuel pressure, regulate burst duration, and calculate firing angles to minimize the risk of blowback. The margin for error was thin. One misfire could ignite the tank itself. But for all its dangers, the promise of the flame tank was undeniable. It was not a mere weapon. It was a statement. The United States was adapting, evolving, and learning to fight. A new kind of war. By the time the invasion fleet assembled for Operation Detachment, the assault on Iwo Jima, a handful of flame-equipped Sherman stood among the ranks of the 5th Marine Tank Battalion. Each bore a layer of volcanic dust, its olive-drab paint dulled by salt and wind. Inside, crews sat in silence, aware that their machines carried both the power to save lives and the burden of unimaginable destruction. For many, it felt as though they were bringing a piece of hell to the battlefield. On the night before the invasion, officers briefed their men about the terrain ahead, the steep beaches, the hidden tunnels, the pillboxes that riddled Mount Suribachi. Intelligence suggested that naval bombardment would soften the defenses, but few believed it would make much difference. The Japanese had spent years preparing. They would not be easily burned out. Still, the presence of the new flame tanks offered a sliver of hope. If they worked, they could end the stalemate that had haunted every island before. As dawn approached on February 19, 1945, the fleet stood ready. Battleships opened fire, lighting the sky with thunder. The sea boiled with landing craft. On the decks of the transports, crews checked their tanks one last time. Valves hissed, gauges trembled. The island ahead glowed faintly under the first light, a shadowed mountain of volcanic ash and iron. Somewhere on the horizon, a Sherman crocodile waited for its baptism of fire. As dawn broke over the black sands, the first flamethrower Sherman rumbled toward the cliffs, its nozzle glinting like the mouth of a dragon. Iwo Jima was unlike any battlefield the Marines had ever faced. The island rose from the Pacific like a fortress, black volcanic sand, jagged ridges, and a single looming giant, Mount Suribachi. For months, the Japanese had turned its interior into a labyrinth of tunnels and bunkers, connecting artillery positions, command posts, and sleeping quarters through more than 11 miles of underground passages. Each entrance was concealed, each position designed to cover the others. There were no front lines. The entire island was a weapon. When the first wave of Marines stormed ashore on February 19, 1945, they found no visible defenders. The beach was eerily quiet. It felt wrong. Then the volcano erupted. Not with lava, but with gunfire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery concealed in the cliffs unleashed a storm that ripped through the landing force. Within minutes, hundreds of men were cut down. The black sand, soft and shifting, offered no cover. Vehicles sank. Bulldozers churned helplessly. Every advance was met by invisible fire from unseen bunkers. The 5th Marine Division fought to gain a foothold, clawing their way up the ashen slopes toward the high ground. But for every bunker destroyed by explosives or grenades, another opened fire from behind or beneath them. The Japanese defense was methodical, mathematical, an interlocking grid of death designed to bleed the enemy dry. By the third day, the Marines were stalled. Entire companies had been reduced to fragments. The volcanic rock absorbed artillery impacts like a sponge. Naval bombardments that could level a city barely scratched the surface. The defenders simply waited below ground until the shelling stopped, then returned to their positions as if nothing had happened. And then came the sound. It began as a low hiss, an unfamiliar mechanical growl cutting through the chaos of battle. Men turned toward it instinctively, unsure what they were hearing. From behind the lines, a Sherman tank rumbled forward, its treads grinding against the glassy sand. The gunner's hatch was open, the operator's face smeared with soot. As it neared the base of a cliff, the tank halted. The bow turret swiveled, a heartbeat of silence. Then, the roar. A river of fire erupted from the tank's nozzle, arching across the battlefield in a searing orange torrent. The flames struck a cluster of pillboxes dug into the hillside, and in an instant they vanished behind a wall of burning fuel. The fire clung to concrete, to steel, to the sand itself. It crawled across the surface like liquid life, consuming everything it touched. Inside the bunkers, oxygen vanished in seconds. The temperature soared past 2,000 degrees. Soldiers hidden in the tunnels screamed as the flames found them through ventilation shafts and firing ports. Even those not directly hit suffocated as the fire devoured every breath of air. For the first time on Iwo Jima, the Japanese line faltered. The Marines watched in stunned silence as the bunker's roof collapsed inward, molten debris spilling out. Moments later, they advanced, cautiously, weapons raised. The position that had held them pinned for 2 days was now a blackened crater. More Shermans moved forward, their engines rumbling like drums of judgment. The tanks fired in rotation, each burst lighting up the landscape. The heat was overwhelming. Marines advancing behind the flame tanks could feel it even from 100 yards away, a suffocating wave that made the air shimmer. One observer described it later. It looked like the earth was breathing fire. With each burst, the tide began to turn. Bunkers that had survived days of bombardment were reduced to smoldering husks in seconds. Japanese machine gunners abandoned their posts, fleeing into the tunnels, only to find the Inferno following them underground. The psychological effect was immediate. Marines who had faced weeks of attritional combat suddenly had a weapon that struck fear even into the most fanatical defenders. "It was the only thing that worked," one tank commander said later. "We tried everything else, explosives, artillery, grenades. But this burned the war out of them." The Japanese had been trained to fight to the death, but nothing in their manuals prepared them for fire that crawled through rock and steel. Inside Mount Suribachi, officers reported chaos as communications lines melted and ammunition stores detonated from the heat. The tunnels filled with smoke so thick that even electric lamps couldn't pierce it. Survivors stumbled through the darkness, gasping for air that no longer existed. The Americans exploited the breakthrough. Infantry squads moved behind the flame tanks, clearing the ruins with rifles and grenades. They advanced methodically. One bunker, one trench, one tunnel at a time. Whenever resistance stiffened, a signal was given, and the Zippos turret would swing toward the threat. The sight of a tank's nozzle beginning to lower was often enough. Japanese soldiers who would have fought to the last instead surrendered, a rarity in the Pacific. To many, it was more honorable to die by the sword than to be burned alive. But not all gave up. Some tried to counterattack. Suicide squads armed with satchel charges rushed the tanks, hoping to destroy them before they could fire again. Many were cut down by supporting riflemen. Those who reached the Shermans found their charges ineffective against the thick armor, dying in flashes of their own creation. As the days passed, the flamethrower tanks became the spearhead of every assault. The Marines nicknamed them Dragons. Their operators, men like Corporal Frank "Red" Johnson, became both feared and revered. Each mission carried the same risk. A lucky shell could turn the tank into a pyre. The crews knew it, but they pressed forward anyway. Johnson's unit, the 5th Marine Tank Battalion, led one of the most decisive pushes toward the base of Suribachi. In front of them lay a network of caves known as the Meat Grinder, a name earned by the number of Marines it had devoured. For 3 days, the infantry had tried to breach it without success. The flame tanks were ordered forward. They approached slowly, their treads crunching over black gravel. Japanese anti-tank guns opened fire, but the Shermans pressed on, their armor shrugging off near misses. As they reached firing range, Johnson gave the signal. The flamethrower ignited with a thunderous hiss. Fire cascaded into the cliffs, pouring into the cave mouths like molten metal. Secondary explosions ripped through the hillside as ammunition stores ignited. When the flames died down, the caves that had once spewed machine gun fire were silent. When the Marines advanced, they found only charred weapons and collapsed tunnels. The meat grinder was finished. Elsewhere, the results were the same. Across Iwo Jima's ridges and plateaus, the Japanese defenses, once thought impenetrable, began to crumble under the relentless assault. Flame tanks and demolitions teams moved in tandem, sealing bunkers with fire and explosives, reducing entire sections of the defense network to ash. In the underground command posts, messages of desperation began to flow. General Kuribayashi, the island's commander, received reports of machines that breathe fire. His officers described bunkers being incinerated from the inside, soldiers vanishing without a trace. For all his experience, Kuribayashi had no countermeasure to offer. Even the most hardened defenders began to lose faith. The invaders had brought a new kind of weapon, one that turned the very earth against them. By the time the American flag rose above Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The flamethrower tanks had done what months of bombing could not. They had broken the heart of Iwo Jima's defenses. Yet for the men who operated them, victory carried no celebration. The aftermath was too horrific to cheer. The smell of burned fuel and flesh hung over the island for days. Marines spoke little about what they'd seen. The fire had done its work. Too well. But on the maps of the Pacific, a new symbol was drawn: fire as a weapon of conquest. As the inferno spread, Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend. What kind of enemy burned entire mountains alive? At first, the Japanese defenders thought they were facing ordinary Shermans. From their concealed gun ports, they watched the American tanks grind through the black volcanic sand, firing their 75mm guns in rhythmic bursts. To them, it was the familiar dance of death. The tank battle they had prepared for since the island's first fortifications were laid. They waited patiently, anti-tank guns loaded and sighted, mortars ready to fire the moment the Shermans crossed the invisible killing zones. Every inch of Iwo Jima had been plotted in advance. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had forbidden wasteful suicide charges and demanded discipline. Each gun would fire only when the target was perfectly in range. Then came a sight no one expected. The leading Sherman halted at the base of a ridge. Its turret didn't elevate. Instead, a smaller nozzle on the bow pivoted toward a pillbox opening. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then a deep hiss, followed by a roar that ripped through the tunnels. A river of fire leapt from the tank's front, flooding the ridge with liquid flame. Japanese gunners in nearby positions froze. The sound was like nothing they had ever heard. Not artillery, not grenades, not even the explosions of naval shells. The fire moved like a living thing, crawling over the ground, sticking to concrete and sandbags, pouring through gun slits and ventilation ducts. The defenders who survived long enough to scream were few. Within seconds, the bunker was gone. Smoke rolled through the trenches. The air itself seemed to burn. Soldiers deeper in the network felt the sudden vacuum as oxygen was consumed by the flames. The tunnels filled with choking fumes. Men stumbled, gasping for breath, clutching at their throats as the inferno devoured every pocket of air. When the fire subsided, the observers who peered from nearby holes could scarcely believe what they saw. The position that had resisted direct hits from naval guns for days had melted. Concrete was scorched black, steel weapons twisted into unrecognizable shapes. The heat was so intense that even cartridge casings had fused together. Word spread rapidly through the underground network. The Americans had brought machines that breathe fire. Messages flooded Kuribayashi's headquarters. Officers described strange tanks capable of projecting flames over astonishing distances, burning entire tunnel systems in seconds. Some reports were dismissed at first. The notion seemed impossible, even fantastical. But when the first wave of survivors stumbled in, their faces blistered, uniforms charred, the truth could no longer be denied. Kuribayashi, a disciplined and pragmatic commander, knew the danger of panic. He ordered his staff to calm the troops and reinforce key positions, yet even he could sense the tremor in his men's voices. The weapon was more than destructive. It was psychological. Propaganda officers had promised the garrison that Iwo Jima was impregnable. The emperor's engineers had built the ultimate fortress, concrete thicker than any bomb could penetrate, steel doors sealed by rock, tunnels that could withstand days of bombardment. The men believed that they could fight forever underground. Now their refuge had become their tomb. As the fire tanks advanced, panic took root. In the labyrinthine tunnels, the usual discipline began to falter. Some soldiers refused to stay at their posts, abandoning their firing positions as soon as they heard the telltale hiss of compressed fuel. Others tried to seal tunnel entrances with sandbags or pour water on the flames, a futile gesture against burning napalm that clung even underwater. One junior officer recorded in his diary, later, recovered from the ruins, a single haunting line: "The earth itself burns." The Americans pressed the advantage. Wherever resistance flared, the flame tanks were called in. The crews operated with grim precision, sweeping their nozzles across hillsides, filling the caves with liquid fire. The black sand of Iwo Jima turned gray from heat, and smoke drifted upward in colossal plumes visible from miles away. Inside the tunnels, Japanese soldiers faced a choice that defied their training. To remain was to suffocate or burn. To flee was to die in the open. Some took their own lives rather than endure either. Others charged blindly toward the enemy, clutching explosives in their hands, hoping to destroy one of the fire-breathing tanks. But even these desperate tactics faltered. The Shermans, heavily armored and closely supported by infantry, often destroyed attackers before they could get close. Those who reached the tanks found that the armor plates, though scalded and blackened, held firm. Kuribayashi's headquarters received one chilling report after another. Flames enter through cracks. Men cannot breathe. The mountain itself is on fire. The general refused to retreat. He understood that Iwo Jima was not merely a battlefield. It was the gateway to Japan itself. Every day the garrison held out, delayed the inevitable invasion of the home islands. But he also knew that morale was collapsing faster than the defenses. He summoned his senior officers and demanded solutions. Could the flames be stopped with barriers? Could the tanks be targeted before they reached firing range? Suggestions poured in. Dig deeper, use smoke, create diversions, flood tunnels with seawater. None proved effective. The flames reached farther than expected, and their heat destroyed pumps and equipment before countermeasures could even be deployed. In the days that followed, Japanese units attempted coordinated counterattacks against the flame tanks. Anti-tank teams armed with 47mm guns and satchel charges lay in wait along suspected approach routes. Some succeeded in destroying one or two Shermans, but at catastrophic cost. For every tank disabled, dozens of attackers died. And even when a flame tank was destroyed, more followed behind. The defenders began to understand the grim truth. This was not a battle of soldiers anymore. It was a battle of machines, and the machines were winning. Reports from surviving units painted scenes of terror. Entire platoons roasted alive inside their bunkers. Ammunition stores ignited, turning tunnels into furnaces. Medical teams were overwhelmed by burn victims, many beyond recognition. Even the hardened officers who had fought in China and Manchuria found themselves shaken. They had never witnessed destruction so absolute. Kuribayashi's radio men sent coded messages to Tokyo describing the situation as untenable. The Imperial General Staff, however, dismissed the warnings. They believed the reports exaggerated, a symptom of low morale. Tokyo's propagandists continued to broadcast messages, praising the defenders of Iwo Jima as unbreakable heroes. But the truth could not be hidden. Japanese listening stations on the mainland intercepted American radio chatter describing the new flame tanks in awe. They heard code names like Zippo and Satan, references to the weapon's hellish nature. Word spread through the ranks of Japan's remaining island garrisons. A new kind of weapon was loose in the Pacific, one that turned stone into ash and air into fire. For Kuribayashi's men, the realization came too late. By the end of February, much of Iwo Jima's tunnel network was unusable. Entire sectors were filled with carbonized bodies, their entrances sealed by collapsed rock. The few surviving outposts above ground were surrounded and incinerated one by one. Those who could still fight did so with the ferocity of the doomed. They ambushed patrols, set traps, and launched suicidal night raids. But their efforts only delayed the inevitable. The flame tanks continued their advance, methodical and unstoppable. When Kuribayashi's final message was sent, a coded farewell to Tokyo, he did not mention defeat. He spoke instead of duty. "Each man will kill 10 of the enemy before dying," he wrote. "We fight to protect the Emperor's land." But by then, the Emperor's land was burning. As the last organized resistance collapsed, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Japan's proud fortress island, built on faith in concrete, discipline, and honor, had been undone by something far simpler: fire. The defenders had believed their fortifications would make them immortal. Instead, the same tunnels that promised protection had become ovens. Even the bravest soldiers could not fight flames that crawled through the earth and devoured air itself. When the imperial staff in Tokyo finally received word that Iwo Jima had fallen, silence filled the command room. The loss was more than strategic. It was symbolic. An entire garrison had been annihilated by a weapon the Japanese barely understood. Had they just witnessed the future of warfare? A future where man no longer fought man, but fire itself? As Tokyo received news of the island's fall, one question echoed through command halls. Had Japan just witnessed the future of warfare? When Iwo Jima finally fell, the silence that followed was almost unbearable. The island's once mighty defenses lay in ruin. A landscape of charred rock, twisted steel, and tunnels filled with the dead. Among the smoke and rubble stood the machines that had made it possible. The flamethrower Shermans. Their nozzles, still blackened from battle, seemed to stare blankly across the wasteland they'd created. For the U.S. Marines, the victory was monumental, but hollow. Nearly 7,000 Americans had died taking an island barely 8 square miles across. Yet the lesson was clear. Against Japan's underground fortresses, conventional weapons were not enough. The flamethrower tank had changed the rules of war. Word of its success spread quickly through the Pacific Command. At first, the M4 Zippo had been an experimental curiosity, a field modification born of desperation. After Iwo Jima, it became doctrine. On Okinawa, entire battalions were equipped with flame tanks. They advanced methodically, one bunker at a time, turning every cave and pillbox into an inferno. Marines and Army infantry began calling for them over the radio with simple, chilling phrases. "Bring up the Zippo." When the tanks arrived, Japanese positions vanished in clouds of burning fuel. On Sugarloaf Hill, a single crocodile cleared a ridgeline that had resisted 3 days of artillery and infantry assaults. On the Shuri Line, entire tunnel systems collapsed under waves of fire that burned for minutes at a time. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Japanese soldiers who had once vowed never to surrender, who had thrown themselves under tanks with explosives rather than yield, now emerged with their hands raised. To face bullets was one thing, to face fire was another. Captured diaries from Okinawa revealed a chilling refrain. The fire tanks leave no escape. Even the proudest samurai spirits faltered before a weapon that denied them an honorable death. Many soldiers prayed for quick destruction by artillery rather than the slow suffocation of flame. Yet for the men inside the tanks, victory came with unease. Operating a flamethrower, Sherman was both power and burden. The crews watched through narrow vision slits as their fuel jets engulfed bunkers, the screams echoing even through armor. After each mission, they often sat in silence, unable to look one another in the eye. "We didn't cheer," one operator later confessed. "We just turned away. You can't celebrate something like that." Inside the tank, the air was thick with the stench of burned fuel and scorched metal. The operators knew that a single bullet or shell could ignite their own fuel reserves, a death as gruesome as the one they dealt. They lived every battle seconds away from becoming their own victims. Many carried that trauma for decades. Some never spoke of what they had seen. Others tried to rationalize it, reminding themselves that without the flamethrower tanks, thousands more Marines would have died storming those tunnels by hand. The weapon had saved lives, but it had also scarred the men who used it. Photographs from the aftermath tell a grim story. Caves reduced to glowing embers. The black outlines of bodies burned into concrete walls. Entire hillsides glazed by heat. The war in the Pacific had already been brutal. But now it was industrialized horror. Strategically, the impact was undeniable. The success of the flame tanks forced Japan to rethink its defensive strategy. The once vaunted network of underground fortresses, the pride of the Imperial Army, was no longer safe. Engineers on the home islands began searching for new ways to resist invasion, but time was running out. The war had entered a phase where technology dictated survival. For American commanders, the flamethrower tank was proof that innovation could shatter even the most stubborn enemy. It became a model for future combined arms warfare: fire and steel, precision and terror. By the summer of 1945, flame weapons were integral to every invasion plan. But something darker was taking shape. The logic behind the flamethrower, using overwhelming, inescapable destruction to break morale, was about to be magnified beyond imagination. The idea that technology could end wars not just through force, but through fear, began to take hold. In laboratories across the United States, scientists were building the next evolution of fire. It was no longer napalm, no longer confined to the battlefield. It was atomic. The same reasoning that justified the Zippos, that any weapon capable of shortening the war was necessary, now fueled the race for the bomb. If fire could win Iwo Jima, perhaps a greater fire could end the war entirely. Months after the flames of Okinawa died down, a different kind of inferno lit the sky over Hiroshima. In that moment, the world saw the ultimate expression of the same terrible idea, that total destruction could bring peace. The fire that began in the tunnels of Iwo Jima had become global. For the men who had fought with flamethrowers, the parallels were impossible to ignore. One Marine veteran years later put it simply, "When I saw the mushroom cloud, I knew we'd just built a bigger Zippo." The legacy of the flame tank is still debated today. Historians call it one of the most effective and most horrifying weapons of World War II. It saved lives by ending battles faster, yet it introduced a new level of moral complexity to modern warfare. It blurred the line between victory and vengeance. After the war, the United States kept developing flamethrower tanks. Korea, Vietnam. Each new conflict refined the technology. Longer range, higher pressure, more precise control. But the principle never changed: dominate through fire. Public opinion, however, shifted. Images from the Pacific haunted generations. By the 1970s, the weapon was largely abandoned, its use restricted under international law. The world had seen enough of war that turned men into ash, and yet the shadow remains. Modern incendiary weapons, from thermobaric bombs to fuel-air explosives, all trace their lineage back to those first fire-belching Shermans on Iwo Jima. Every time a weapon promises to burn through a problem, history whispers a warning. The flamethrower tank was a symbol of ingenuity, of desperation, and of the price humanity pays for progress. It showed that technology could save lives and destroy souls at the same time. On the beaches of Iwo Jima, Among the wrecks still half buried in volcanic ash, pieces of those flame tanks remain. Rusted, silent, but unmistakable. The scars they left are carved not just in the island, but in memory. For the Marines who survived, Iwo Jima would forever be a place where courage and horror coexisted, where the line between hero and monster blurred in the glow of a burning tunnel. In the end, the flamethrower tank won the battle, and perhaps even hastened the end of the war. But it also revealed something humanity has struggled to accept ever since: that victory achieved through fire is indistinguishable from tragedy. When atomic fire replaced napalm months later, the world realized the inferno had only just begun. When the war finally ended, the world was too exhausted to look back. Cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and the atomic age had dawned. The great battles of the Pacific faded into the fog of peace, their weapons quietly dismantled or scrapped. Yet, among the steel relics left behind, one invention carried an unspoken legacy: the flamethrower tank. It had not been a weapon of glory, nor one of precision. It was a tool of necessity, born from desperation and refined in the crucible of total war. But its influence reached far beyond the beaches of Iwo Jima. It became a study in fear, proof that terror itself could be weaponized as effectively as any bullet. In the years that followed, the lessons of the flame tanks resurfaced again and again. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, engineers reintroduced flamethrower-equipped Shermans and their successors. The names had changed: M67, POA, CWS, H5. But the principle remained the same. Fire conquers where courage and gunfire cannot. On the Korean peninsula, they fought through frozen hills and concrete bunkers, spraying jets of liquid flame into tunnels dug by the North Koreans and Chinese. Reports from the front mirrored those from the Pacific. Fire that rolled like water, consuming everything in its path. The sight alone shattered enemy morale. Entire garrisons abandoned fortified positions without a shot fired. By Vietnam, the technology had evolved. The tank-mounted flamethrower gave way to a new form of delivery: the airstrike. Aircraft like the F-4 Phantom and the A-1 Skyraider carried canisters of napalm, a direct descendant of the same thickened gasoline first tested inside Sherman hulls. Dropped from the sky, it coated jungles and villages alike in molten fire. The concept had scaled. What once cleared a single cave on Iwo Jima could now erase square miles in seconds. The world watched, horrified. Television cameras captured scenes of forests igniting, of smoke rising in pillars over distant hills. The imagery that had been hidden in the volcanic haze of 1945 now filled living rooms across America. For the first time, civilians saw what firepower truly meant. Historians later called it psychological warfare by chemistry. The same thinking that birthed the flamethrower tank, that fire could break not just defenses but human will, had become central to modern military doctrine. Fear had become as valuable as fire itself. Yet even as the technology advanced, the moral discomfort lingered. Pilots spoke of feeling the same unease as the tank crews before them. "You never forget what napalm smells like," one recalled. "It's victory and loss all at once." In the decades that followed, nations began to question whether such weapons had a place in a civilized world. The 1980 United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons placed restrictions on the use of incendiary devices against civilian populations. The flamethrower, once a proud symbol of American ingenuity, was now a weapon few wanted to acknowledge. But its legacy was too deeply woven into the fabric of modern warfare to disappear. Thermobaric bombs, fuel-air explosives, and other high-energy incendiaries all stemmed from the same grim principle first tested in the Pacific: use the environment itself as a weapon. Replace bullets with pressure. Replace shrapnel with fire. In military academies, tacticians studied the flame tanks not for their mechanical design, but for what they represented: the merging of engineering, psychology, and ruthlessness. They were a case study in how innovation, when stripped of restraint, could redefine the boundaries of war. For the men who had built them, those lessons came too late. Many of the original engineers who worked on the Hawaiian prototypes lived long enough to see footage from Vietnam. Some expressed pride that their work had saved lives in 1945. Others admitted regret. "We thought we were making a weapon to end a battle," one engineer said in a 1969 interview. "Instead, we built a blueprint for the future." In the decades after the war, a handful of restored Sherman tanks found their way into museums. Their flamethrower mounts were removed, the scars of battle sanded smooth, and fresh coats of olive paint gave them a false serenity. Children climbed on them, unaware that these same machines had once breathed fire into mountainsides. Curators avoided mentioning the flamethrowers in detail. It was easier to speak of valor than vaporization, easier to celebrate victory than to confront the methods that made it possible. But for those who knew the history, the silence spoke louder than words. Each polished Sherman was a reminder of a time when the line between necessity and nightmare was crossed in the name of survival. The flamethrower tank had done more than win battles. It had revealed the hidden face of modern warfare. It showed that progress in war was not about precision or efficiency, but about erasing the distinction between weapon and terror. The same mindset that created the Zippo tank, total destruction in pursuit of total victory, later fueled the development of nuclear weapons, napalm air raids, and even psychological operations designed to break civilian populations. The methods evolved. The philosophy did not. And yet buried beneath the horror was an undeniable truth. The weapon had worked. It had shortened the war. It had saved lives on the beaches of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. It had achieved what artillery and bombing could not. That paradox remains the enduring legacy of the flame tank, that something so monstrous could also be merciful. Historians still debate whether its use was justified. Was it a necessary evolution of warfare or a step too far? In the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the question became part of a larger moral reckoning. Humanity had learned that its capacity to invent was rivaled only by its capacity to destroy. In time, the image of the flamethrower tank faded into history books and documentaries, overshadowed by the atomic bomb. Yet its influence burned quietly beneath the surface. Every time a new weapon promised to end conflict through sheer devastation, echoes of Iwo Jima returned. Today, the last surviving flame tanks sit in open-air exhibits, their tracks frozen, their hulls rusting under the sun. Tourists walk past them, snapping photographs, unaware of the legacy they carry. To most, they are relics, just another machine from another war. But to those who remember, they are something else entirely, a reminder of how close humanity came to mastering the art of annihilation. The story of the flamethrower Sherman is not just about innovation or victory. It is about what happens when invention crosses a moral threshold, when the pursuit of survival turns into an obsession with domination. It stands as both a triumph of engineering and a warning to every generation that follows, because the fire that burned on Iwo Jima never truly died. It lived on in the glow of jet fuel over Korea, in the orange sky above Vietnam, in the shockwaves of Baghdad and Kabul. It lived on in the minds of those who believed that the fastest path to peace was through total destruction. And in that way, the flame tank's legacy became larger than war itself. It became a mirror, showing what humanity is capable of when fear, ingenuity, and desperation combine. What began as a desperate improvisation on a Pacific beach became a symbol of total war, the moment humanity learned how easily innovation could cross the line between survival and terror. The fire that won the islands never went out. It simply changed form.